Welcome to the Millionaire University podcast. I'm your host, Brien Gearin, with you today. And on this edition of the MU Pod, I'm joined by Brian O'Connor. He's the owner of TalentHQ, an overseas talent placement company. And also, he is a digital nomad. He's been to or through nearly 20 countries to date, and he's currently residing in Colombia. So, Brian, welcome to the show, my man.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, this is gonna be great. We're gonna tackle a topic that is it's usually on my mind, and I think it's on the mind of a lot of business owners, but especially digital business owners. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. I'm sure there's overseas talent is highly utilized, but I also think kind of totally underutilized to date.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that in depth. We're going to talk about some of the myths or some of the pitfalls or some of the beliefs about hiring overseas that might otherwise inhibit a business owner from actually taking the step and the leap and doing what could really be a huge positive move for their business. So, Brian, we're going to chat about that, but first I want to get a little bit of an origin story. I want to hear a little bit about, how did you end up doing what you're doing? Where did you start and how'd you end up in Colombia?
I'm excited. I'm excited. Cool. So I have the corporate to entrepreneur path, right? I did 6 years in management consulting, right? Picture like, I don't know, boardrooms, a fancy suitcase, fancy suits, leather suitcase type thing, right? And I started kind of talking about my experience on the internet. And the way that I did that was I had a friend who was another consultant, like didn't have time to talk to advise a friend of his, sent him to me, and he was having some basic problems with his business that we were solving day to day with the corporates with like basic frameworks, and he was really frustrated, right? And so when I gave him our frameworks, he was so relieved, like I kid you not, he kind of cried on the phone, which is a fascinating story for me, because on the corporate side, people like it's more of a it's less personal, right? When you're helping small businesses, like it's about their passion, their life. You're helping them have a better life. And so I realized that what we were doing on the consulting side with the big businesses was so useful to the small businesses. So I started typing it on Twitter, LinkedIn, and it took off. I got 85,000 followers, 14,000 email readers, and kind of switched to doing that full time, helping small business owners. And then been doing it since I could do it on the internet and traveling around.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So when you say small business owners, so are these like Main Street mom and pop type of gigs, or are they kind of 5 to 10 million plus type of companies, or are they in a certain niche, or is it all over?
So my sweet spot tends to be 5 to 10 million, right? We'll do some 20, etc. The reason that 5 million is the target for that is because sub 3 million, it's much more tactical, right? You're 0 to 1, you're finding product market fit. 1 to 3, you're kind of scaling product market fit a little bit, but it doesn't. At between 3 and 5, the wheels start to come off if you don't have systems, if you don't have strategy, if you don't have the type of things that we were doing with the big businesses. And so I mostly get consulting calls when the wheels start to come off, which tends to be around 3 to 5 million if you don't have systems in place and culture thought out and management and all those kind of things. And so that's where I focus.
Okay. So you found your way from corporate into consulting and basically helping these businesses systematize and keep the wheels on, if you will,
Exactly.
reel them back in and put the lug nuts back on for them. How did that start transitioning into Talent HQ and being part of finding solutions with overseas talent?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, so my focus in consulting, back when I was at Deloitte, I did marketing strategy, growth strategy, those types of things. And so helping the small businesses were more on the marketing side. And so I'd make a marketing strategy, a marketing plan, and they would say, great, but who's going to run that strategy, right? Who's going to execute that plan, right? And so we needed a team. And so what I would do is go find marketers to put in and run the actual and get, I don't know, build a team of marketers so that they can make the plan a reality. The challenge is at that size, if you need 5 marketers, it's hard to afford that in the US, right? And so we started looking for talent overseas to get the same quality, but to be able to afford the whole team that we needed, not just part of the team. And this, we don't have to wait until the business grows enough to afford each individual role. We can get them all at once. And so when I did that for one business, I started doing it for a few others, and that part of the business ended up taking off because it's a big need that a lot of people have. So those became two kind of independent businesses where I'm advising small businesses on their marketing strategy and plan, but then also putting people into those businesses to actually make that marketing a reality.
Okay. And so then Talent HQ, you're on the ground. You're in Colombia, you're in Latin
Correct.
America. You
Correct.
are actually in these places where where the overseas talent resides. So tell us a little bit more about Talent HQ. So you're meeting with talent, or do you have, is it all about your network down there where you can be like, "Hey, we have a company who has XYZ needs," and through your network, you know 5 or 6 people who can apply for this type of job. How does that work for you?
Yeah, I'd say it's a combination of two things. One is like the to your point, meeting people in person that can fill the role because we do a lot of our talent in Colombia. But the other one is building out distribution channels. And so what I mean by that is we've been able to create relationships with Latin American, say, marketing influencers, people who have like Latin American communities that teach marketing or have marketing communities that we can do while we're on the ground here, meeting those people in person who lead those communities and then can distribute our roles to those people. And so that helps our distribution wildly. I mean, I'd say the average role we get, call it 300 to 400 applicants per role. I think we had a record. We actually had a record last week. So we had a project manager role go for 1,040 applicants in 24 hours. And so the distribution we're able to get here is insane. So yeah, ecstatic being here.
So let's talk a little bit more about Latin American talent versus, like, I guess the probably when most business owners, especially if they're hearing about it for the first time, when they hear overseas talent, perhaps they think, I'm going to Upwork and I'm finding someone from the Philippines or Pakistan or, kind of that area of the globe. But I feel like Latin America and Latin American talent is kind of a newer, I don't know if phenomenon is the right word, but kind of the hotter thing right now. What's the difference? Why Latin American talent versus any other?
So there's a few differences. I'd say the biggest one that I'm most fan of is the cultural difference, right? And so there's some cultures that are best at what I'll call coloring within the lines, right? If you have a task can be done where you have a set of 5 instructions and they never have to veer from those instructions, then there's cultures that are great following those instructions, right? That recipe. So take like Filipino culture, for example. With Filipino culture, they are very loyal. They definitely admire like U.S. folks, foreigners, etc. And so when you tell them what they do, they're awesome at following it. Sometimes because of that this is the downside of the upside. Because of that, when the guidance or what they have to do falls outside or they have to color outside lines a little bit, things can break. Not always. There's plenty of great talent there too, but for certain types of tasks, cultures that are better at coming up with their own answers to questions and problem solving type things are better versus when there's tasks where you have to follow kind of step by step, those cultures may be better. And so I'm a fan of LATAM for more critical thinking, kind of free form type things where you don't want to write out the instructions and recipe for every step.
So I'm coming at this as a marketing company owner, and
Yeah.
I think there's a million examples running through my head where we'll do things that my people need to have some creative ability to be
Yeah.
able to produce on their own and not have to call me and say, "Hey, what do you want here?"
Yeah.
It's more of me saying, "Use your creativity and put something together here that I know that will work or that is, creative," right? I had examples of this with one of my email copywriters today. We have three new launches that were going out this morning,
Yeah.
and there were a few areas of feedback that I provided that said, "Hey, rather than just this line or just this kind of this feels a little bland, let's put a little pep in this step. Let's spice up the copywriting a little bit," right? Where I can imagine where if someone from a culture where this is steps 1 through 7 to get this launched, boom, 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 boom. But I guess you're saying if there's room to need some sort of creativity and kind of take that initiative, perhaps different cultures might not do that.
Right. So, your example, right? You're like, hey, I need more pep in this step. I need more spice. Can you give that to me? Right? That's a pretty vague instruction, right?
Right.
But
Exactly.
you're right. But some people can run with that, right? There's some people who can run
Yeah.
with that. Some people who can't. Is it to say that all folks from one culture can't? No, absolutely not. You can find people in every country who are able to do that, right? But as broad brush as a whole, that if in those more creative fields, when I've tried with say Filipino talent or others, I needed to give very, very literal examples, like the exact chat GPT prompt you need to use to get this outcome, right?
Mhm.
Um, and if you have to change the prompt a little bit, it's not going to break. Versus that example you gave, which is just like, hey, can you put some more pep in a step? Can you add some more spice?
Right.
That is going to be better in cultures that aren't as, call it, rule following, for lack of
Mhm.
better terms,
Yeah.
where they've got a little more creativity.
It's like I can't sit here and explain exactly what I want here, but I'll
Yes.
know it when I see it, and I know you can do it type of thing, right? But
Yeah.
if that's
Yeah,
just not
exactly.
part of the mindset, it's not going to happen.
Exactly. So if
Okay.
that's your thinking, where you go, hey, for this type of work, I can't explain exactly what I need, then that's going to be better in, say, Latin America. Versus if you say,
Mhm.
hey, I can explain exactly what I need, and I can't think of situations where to go outside this explanation, then that would be better in, say, Philippines, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's part of the role design. So I worked with a client last week who they needed two roles, right? One was more rule following, the other wasn't. And so one of the benefits of Philippines is it is cheaper than America, right? So what we ended up doing was we took the more rule following one, lowered the price, brought it to Philippines, and we took that price difference and moved it to LATAM so we could get the best of both worlds because we just taken the arbitrage on the prices of cost of living.
Okay, I love it. So let's talk about some of the myths involved with hiring overseas talent. What I think there's a whole lot of them we could probably wrap on, but what are some of the top myths that you see that you could help us dispel today?
Sure. So I think one of the big ones, there's a bunch, let's start with one, around quality, right? Some people say, hey, look, the stuff that hides in my back office and doesn't touch the customer, that I can offshore. I can't do anything that touches the customer, right? I need the highest quality, etc., right? Um, and I think the reason that mentality happens, right, is because to your point, they may have a bad experience with either a bad hiring process and then blame the country, right, or they may go to a country with a different culture than they expect, right, and then blame all offshore, right. And so I think there's great client facing talent, especially in Latin America. That's what I know best. And if you get the hiring process right and you get the onboarding process right, you'll find great talent. If you don't, you may have a bad hiring process, may have a bad onboarding process, and then blame the talent. And I don't think that's a fair comparison.
Okay. So you mentioned the onboarding process. I think this is something that a lot, especially the smaller business, maybe that's too broad a statement because I'm sure there's a lot of larger size businesses who might still not have their ish put together, right? Those SOPs, those standard operating procedures. Is that something, what do you recommend to business owners when it comes to having that type of stuff ready to hire? I know I'm sidetracking here, going down a rabbit
Let's
hole, but
do
I'm
it.
so
Let's do it.
curious because this is something that it took me a while to build out for my company, but I think a lot of people have questions around that, and I'd love to hear your take on it.
Sure. So how do you onboard? So just to clarify, how to onboard, how to build SOPs, like just to narrow down the question.
Yeah, like when if let's say you're working with a client and it's time to onboard, they hired someone from your agency, they're about to onboard. What do you tell them? Do they need a bunch of videos that show them exactly how their job is going to work? Do they need to spend 3 weeks, 4 weeks with the new hire and sit down and I mean virtually, but sit down with them and walk them through exactly how it is? I think a lot of business owners are probably worried about the time commitment because they have so much going on a day-to-day basis. They're like, how could I possibly have time to onboard somebody?
Yes. So I think the first thing to dispel is the time commitment thing, right? And the reason I say that is because I do believe that people are one of the biggest leverage things you can have in the business, right? If let's say you onboard one person onboards correctly, the other person onboards incorrectly, right? And you do that for a team, let's say of 5 people, right? That means that 5 people, if you onboard incorrectly, will do something wrong that you have to fix every single day for 3, 5, whatever years, right? That's
Mm,
like anti-leverage, right? That eats your
yeah.
time more than, and I'm sure you've heard that famous thing where it's like, oh, this will take me more time to fix than to do it myself. I might as well do it myself. And then boom, the problem you're back to is you have no time, right?
Mhm.
And I think that you have no time probably because you didn't like adequately empower others to do things for you. So my challenge there is to say Yes, you may not have time now, but if you don't do this, imagine how much less time you have in the future,
Mhm.
right? The other, so that's the caveat. The other side of it is it does take time to set up the first time, which I do have templates, by the way. I've made templates. If that's helpful to you guys, I can share. But once you build it once, it's much easier to build it the next time, right? Because the kind of things that you have to do during onboarding are like, for example, setting values, right? It sounds fluffy, right? But there's a big amount of synergy, using fluffy consulting words, between your SOPs and your values. What I mean by that is you can't SOP everything. I think what people tend to build 1,000 SOPs, but who's going to read 1,000 SOPs? And
Mhm.
so I think there's this balance where you take the most mission critical parts of the business, turn those into SOPs because you can't mess those up. And then the parts that aren't covered by the SOP are covered by the values of your business. Why do I say that? Well, because it's your job to every person who comes into your business, or imagine you're the captain of the boat, and every person who comes in, you have to make sure they all row the same way, right? You have to make sure that they know
Right.
what success looks like. And that's what onboarding is. Onboarding is making sure that every person, the idea of success in your head is clearly articulated into the head of the person you've just brought into the business. And so that for me means taking the values of your business and putting them in front of the person, giving the resources they need to answer their own questions, SOPs, right?
Mhm.
Knowing what performance looks like you'll have performance on X amount of time. If you don't hit these metrics, you're out. Those kind of things. And so all that clarity comes during the onboarding process.
Yeah, it's all through the proper onboard, and I can see how I'm sure it's happened before where a lack of a proper onboard meant that a person who probably would have done really well at that job may not be there any longer because there was no proper onboard.
Yeah, it just to give you a simple example, think about if are you familiar with Paul Graham's essay, Maker versus Manager?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so someone who builds the maker has a different communication style and communication needs than someone who manages the manager, right? Now, if you're listening to this, you may be in a manager role, and so you have manager expectations for communication. The person you hired may be a maker, so they have maker type expectations for communication. That inherently is a conflict, right?
Mhm.
And so without saying it and clearly defining what good communication means to you, you're already set up for a clash, right? And so
Right.
part of it, I have whole sections, and I'm looking at my SOPs now, on what does good communication look like versus what does bad communication look like. Because if I never tell my talent that they should have maker style communication, expect me to have manager style communication, here's how the two marry together, then I expect failure. So I need to tell them, right? If someone's not doing what I expect, it's either because they didn't know they had to, my fault, that's communication. They didn't know how to, also my fault, that's training, right? Or they didn't want to, also my fault, that's motivation. All of that to me is initially the initial seeds there are during onboarding.
Wow. Okay. So can you give us some examples of what you were just explaining in terms of how, because I'm coming at this from the business owner perspective, I'm thinking to myself, what does this look like? What does it look like when we're properly onboarding somebody? And are these communications, are they things that are like, are we talking about stand-up meetings, or is it, one-to-ones within the first 3 weeks that are intense, that are, going over everything? Or is it more of a, here's what we do, here's how we flow. Let's just get to know each other and, walk before we run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one kind of reminder caveat is that my business is fully remote, right? And so that means a few things. One is like we have to design the workplace for a remote first type thing. And the other thing is that for in person, a lot of people are amazing communicators in person, but the second they go to remote, right? They don't email as well, they don't Slack as well, they're not as clear, that kind of thing. And so I don't think you can have a flexible work environment and poor communication. I think you have to pick one, right? So you have
Hmm.
to have, if you're going to be fully remote, you need stellar communication. Why do I say that? Because that means that you have to take the time and communicate how important this is if you're onboarding remote talent. So what I do, at least, it depends on the role, but for, let's say, account manager, right? What I'll do is I'll have a kickoff call to get people to welcome them to the business and overview the basics, right? So that's things like, what's our mission? I want everybody, like one the thing with remote talent is remote talent may not get all the information that an in-person talent person would. And so you have to make them feel like they're also building the business with you, that they're part of it, that everyone's kind of going on the same mission, right?
Hmm. Okay.
I think there's this famous quote. I want to say JFK, right? He went to go visit. Oh yeah, it was JFK. So JFK went to go visit NASA, right? And he bumps into a janitor, right? And he's like, "What are you doing?" And the janitor's like, "I'm helping put a man on the moon," right?
Hmm.
Everybody needs to know what you're about. That's important. So anyway, I take time to say, okay, look, you need to deeply understand what we're about. You need to understand our mission. You need to understand our values. And I actually beat a dead horse. Like when we sit there, we have 4 values, right? And we sit there and we say, okay, what are examples of poor versions of this? What are examples of good versions of this? What does success look like, right? With each of our
Hmm.
values. Then what's our culture and what's our ways of working, right? So ways of working are just like, think of ways that you use a tool. Not like let's use, so we use for task manager, we use Asana, for example, right?
Hmm.
When I say ways of working, you can Google how to use Asana, right? This isn't like hit tab Q and then it creates a task. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is if I want to assign you, so say Brian, I want to assign you a task, right? Do you have to accept it offline? How do we manage like the due deck? How do you decline a task, right? What kinds of things do we have a conversation about in Asana versus in Slack, right? This is just examples off the top of my head, but they're just ways that your company works. Like what kinds of things go into which tool? What's best practice in terms of like how do you accept tasks or postpone tasks or ask questions about tasks, those kinds of things. Where if you don't kind of clarify what that means, then it's kind of a mess because you'll ask a question. Like some people will put documents in Google Drive, whereas others put them in Asana and others put them into Slack, right? And so yeah, so we try to clarify like how do we work together? What kind of timing do we expect on responses to things? How do we talk to clients? All those kind of things we try to clear up in that initial onboarding phase.
Yeah. Do you encounter business owners that, I guess maybe a better question, do you have to turn businesses away that might not have these things ready to go when it's time to hire, even though their business is at a stage of needing to hire, but you've identified they don't have their SOPs, or they don't have the vision, they don't have their mission and things that are ready to be shared?
Um, I don't, and the reason I don't is because we off as part of our deal, we offer like advisory on these things.
Oh,
Because I
okay.
assume, so this is something I did a lot at Deloitte. Was just basically like we went into businesses. Like I've one example, like there was this hedge fund that just blew up, like got really big really quickly, and they were still in Excel. And so some processes that used to take them 2 hours now took them literally 2 weeks. And so we
Mhm.
went in, created systems, and figured out like how do we optimize the business to actually function, right? And so because of that, like I have a ton of resources on just like literally how do you onboard people right? How do you set them up for success? The reason I do that is because what I'm most incentivized to make sure that the talent excels. If I find the best talent in the world for you and I place in your business and you don't have these systems set up, they're gonna fail, even though they're amazing talent. But and when they fail, you go, that was horrible talent. I'm never talking to Brian again. TalentHQ is out.
Mhm.
But if I sit with you while we're searching for people and I like check through your stuff and say, okay, actually, here's the updates, here's these new systems, just copy paste, put them in here. Then I put someone, they're much more likely to succeed. 3 months from now, you call me, you go, wow, that was amazing. Like my talent's doing great, the business is doing great. I actually want 2 people now, right?
Mhm.
And so I see this as a long-term relationship, not just like a transactional thing. And I fully believe because of that. I mean, I'm really proud of the stat. 70% of our clients come back for more, right? Most people, 70% of people who come and ask us for talent come back and ask us for another. And
Wow.
I think that's part of it, right? Because they have a good experience on like making sure that the talent can actually succeed.
Yeah, because there's so much of that in my business experience where before we even get to the tactical things, we have got to figure out a few of your infrastructure issues and then talk strategy and then enter the tactics as part of that strategy. And I think in your line of work, there's a lot of that that doesn't get done where it's more so of a, oh, hey, here's 10 people for you to go interview. And where's our cut, by the way? When really the business owner is not in a position to do this correctly and it serves nobody. So I think that's huge for you having that consulting background to be able to go in and actually help these businesses do this before even hiring
Yeah,
intent.
I like it a lot, because part of it is I'm also just here to help people, right? So like
Mhm.
to give you an example, remember that maker manager distinction I gave you a moment
Mhm.
ago? That's a real example. So we had a client like a month ago, I want to say 2 months ago, who onboarded really quickly, didn't take the onboarding process too seriously, and they had that maker manager issue, right? Communication. And so the emails I got were basically explaining the issue and then asking, should I record this person's screen, right? And like document their time, right? And all these things that are just, in my opinion, this is a controversial take I have. I think those time trackers, the screen recorders when you're trying to record remote talent screen, I think it's a crutch for lazy management, right? If you only care about the output and the outcome, and you have the systems in place for them to succeed, they know where to go when they have questions, they know what success looks like, then you don't have to worry about whether they log in at 9 a.m. Unless, of course, it's like a customer service role where they need to. That's a different animal.
I'm familiar with that too because with my team, I don't care when you do the work.
Yeah.
All I care is that it's done by the time it needs to be done and it's done exceedingly well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one of those things where with remote talent, if you can have that attitude of, you don't have to, it's not like you're their big brother, you're not their lord, right? It's a matter of, is the work getting done? Is it getting done the way you need it done? And do you like working with them as
Yeah.
well, right?
Right. And to your point, if it doesn't matter what time you log in and log out, right, you can have that, but you need stellar communication, right?
Mhm.
People need to let you know if they're going to log out early, right? They need to know they need to let you know that they won't be available to catch the ball if you're going to pass to them, right? They need
Mhm.
to let you know what's left, right, and what's going to be done tomorrow, all those kinds of things. Versus on the other side of the fence, if you're like, hey, you're logging in at 9, I'm recording your screen, I know exactly what's going on, then that level of communication isn't as necessary, right? And
Right.
so that's why I think it's a crutch, because you can choose to either improve the communication of your business, or I don't want to say improve, but enhance the handcuffs that go into it, right? Make it more
Mhm.
controlling environment.
Right.
I do think it's harder to get to nail the communication side, but it's much more valuable if you can figure that out.
Okay. So one of my questions is around cultural differences. So, obviously every culture has its differences, right? There's things that we don't understand about other cultures in the same way that other cultures don't understand about ours. What are some things that you notice between a business in the States and talent that's placed from Latin America that might be attributable to cultural differences?
So, clash between Latin culture and like a US business culture, basically.
Yeah, like, is there something that we wouldn't know about Latin American culture that is very true down there, but it could affect the relationship between the business owner and the talent?
Yeah, the two things that jump out to me, and for context, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I actually grew up in Ecuador.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
I'm,
So you're very
yeah, so
familiar.
yeah, I'm actually half Latino. My mom's from Ecuador, so I grew up in Latin culture, which is part of the reason we have a distribution advantage here. I can run ads in Spanish and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. The Irish last name really throws you through a loop, though.
I know. Brian O'Connor, look at me too, right?
I
It's
love it.
yes, it's hidden in there. But anyway, so I think the two that jump out to me are one is the way we view time, right? Meetings and time. And then the other is the importance of relationship versus transaction. So I'll start with the first one. In terms of time, right? So you and I think we had this start at the top of the hour, right? And if I join at the top of the hour, I'm late. I joined a minute early, right? That's U.S. culture. That's what we're used to. Latin culture by default runs a little behind, right? That like start time, that heart palpitation that I get if I join a minute late doesn't exist on that.
Hmm.
Now that's easily fixable, and if you're working with them, because they know they're working in the U.S. culture, right? And so they're trying to adapt to U.S. culture. So one of the things that's actually one of my ways of working is join 30 seconds to a minute early. Joining on time is joining late, right? And so that's a performance point. People join late, like we talk about during performance.
Hmm.
The other thing, and as I think out loud, this may be more of a management thing and a persuasion thing than actually no, this will apply. So in Latin culture, everything's relationship based, right? And sure, there's an argument that in the U.S. things are we're on the conversation because we know a mutual person and all those kind of things. But the weight of that is much more in Latin culture than it is in U.S. culture. We can be a lot more transactional and do things just because it's beneficial to our business. In Latin America, it's more about strength of relationships, and we'll do things because of strength of relationships more often than what's best for business. And so, does that mean that you have to, if you're running a team of Latin Americans, you have to focus on building strong relationships with them? Not necessarily, because they do a great job kind of adapting to the U.S. culture because like they know they're working in their culture versus if you were working in their culture. Um, so I'd say even though those are cultural differences in terms of how they work, I don't think it impacts the business as much as if you were going to go work with and do a deal with a Latin American company, let's say.
Okay, interesting. And what types of, cuz I could imagine there's some listeners out there who are probably wondering, is overseas talent good for me? Or do I run a business where it wouldn't be so beneficial? Or maybe the people I need have to be customer facing and they have to meet XYZ criteria. Is Latin American talent, does it span the board from those who are easily customer facing versus just maybe in a fulfillment role or, something that's more tactical? What does that look like in terms of Latin American talent?
So customer facing versus back office.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from a customer facing perspective, I think you need two things, right? And a lot of our roles are customer facing. We get a ton of like what I'll call like account managers, like sales folks. We get a lot of those. And so I do think it's a great place for that for two reasons. One is language, right? A lot of people, one of the biggest objections is yes, but there's a language barrier, right? I'd like to put them in front of clients, but the language, right? And the other one, I'm gonna hit the other point before I explain it, is charisma. We talked about the Latin culture a little bit. One thing that I love about Latin culture is it's much more warm, relationship based, charismatic, extroverted, that kind of thing. I call it the Latin flair.
Hmm.
And because of that, what I'll call Latin flair, it is a very charismatic culture, which is something that I'd like to put in front of a client. So if you're comparing different cultures or who can be client facing, I love LATAM for that reason. Now, on the language side, I think people conflate and confuse, say, an accent versus bad English, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a difference between someone speaking with like great English, but having a non-native accent, right? No one docks you for that. Nobody cares about that, right? My account manager has an accent and my clients love her. Versus having just bad level English, that is different. That's not acceptable, right? For a client-facing role.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do and the way we get around that is we get 300-400 applicants a role, and one of the filters is you need to hit a certain level of English. Right? We have them tell us there's a ranking in LATAM of like how good are you at English. We only accept the ones over that certain rank. Then we have them submit a video of themselves speaking so we can hear it and make sure that once again it's not the accent, but it's the ability to understand, the ability to speak, that kind of thing. So if you have good English and you're charismatic enough to speak to customers, LATAM is a great place to be.
Right. Okay. So, what does it look like from a business owner's investment standpoint? I know different roles will surely carry different salaries or different pay methods. How does that stack up on average when you're hiring out of Latin America?
Yeah, so I would say if you have, I don't know, a role in the US that's say $7,000 a month, $6,000 a month, right? That same role will probably go for 1,500 a month in Latin America,
Wow.
right? And so the savings are massive. But then here's the other side of the coin. Here's where it gets a win-win. That 1,500 in a lot of cases is double what a company in Colombia would pay, right? So I'll
Hmm.
give you a good friend of mine. She started out Colombian company, $800 a month, right? Started contracting with the U.S., 1,500 to the U.S. company. That's a huge cost savings. To her, she just doubled her income,
Yeah.
right? It's cost of living is a lot lower, and so they're able to essentially live a lot better on amounts that in the US would be different.
Wow. Okay. So that is massive. And then are these full-time positions, or is it a matter of how much the business owner needs, or is it full-time only?
I'm talking full time here. There are part time available, but I think part time is harder to pull off from a culture, values, onboarding, all that kind of stuff we're talking about. I do think full time is where it's at.
Okay. And what type of positions does the talent that you recruit typically fall in? Or is that an extensive list, or do you guys focus more on specific type of positions to hire for?
So we focus on kind of two buckets of positions. One is marketing roles, right? I'm a CMO. My co-founder sold his email marketing agency, right? And so we understand that role pretty well, very well. And so we're able to see that's where we're able to gauge the talent. We actually run them through tests, what we'll call a pilot project, where we look at their background, their test results, and based on that we can tell how good they are. So think like paid media, email marketing, content creation, graphic design, those types of marketing roles. On the other side is more admin roles. So think like admin sales type roles. So think like data entry. We have BDRs slash SDR, whatever you want to call them, typical VAs, that kind of stuff.
Okay. And is the talent like maybe I'll try and get granular here. If you're hiring for a marketing role, do you have talent where they have proven expertise or they've learned expertise in how to run Google ads, search campaigns, or how to manage social media ad campaigns? Are they very specific tactical skills that they have, or is that a wide range?
So it can be. So they can be either highly specialized or kind of more junior general staff. I think there's two different. Let's say in the recruiting world, right? There's kind of what I'll call inbound recruiting versus outbound recruiting, right? So inbound is like what our process. So as I said, we had a role last week. So you want a project manager, let's say, right? We account managers and project managers are our sweet spot. We love that, and so we ran that. We got 1,000 applications, right? And we have a whole process to find the top 0.1%, I guess it is, of 1,000 applications, right? And get them in front of you. That's one process. We run that because we're marketers, we understand funnels, we have distribution channels, all that kind of stuff. The more specialized you get, you have to switch from what inbound, which is what we run, to outbound, right? And so if you want 7 years experience in this industry plus like email marketing, it's harder to run an inbound process for that. And so what you do is you have to find individual people, reach out to them directly, and likely poach them from other companies, right? And so that's kind of like a one-on-one targeted type thing. We do the more inbound. I think once it hits a certain level of specialization, then it needs to switch to an outbound approach.
Okay, gotcha. So I know we started. I took us down a couple rabbit holes.
Yeah, love the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I'm known for those. I might as well call me Rabbit.
All about it.
But we were talking about some of the myths. Did we cover most of the myths, or is there a few other outliers that we haven't talked about that are potentially in the way of business owners who could really benefit from hiring Latin American talent?
Yeah, I think the big ones are so quality wise, right? So people are like, hey, quality doesn't hit, right? And we talked about that. The one thing around the quality is that we didn't mention is a lot of people don't make an apples to apples comparison, right?
Mm,
So here's an example. So I worked with a founder a few months ago who was like, hey, I want someone to like, I need these skills of like a C-suite person, right? They were like, they in their head, they had imagined that the quality isn't out there for an offshore person because they were comparing, say, executive level US folks to mid tier offshore folks. You know what I mean? So
mhm.
like a lot of people will say, hey, I can't find someone with the like with this level of critical thinking that I have, right? But if they went for that for a more junior role, but if they went for that same role in the US, they would also not find that level of critical thinking, right? And so a lot of times it's not an apples to apples comparison. I would say really broad brush strokes. There's like if you're gonna pay for I don't know a $80,000 a year role, that's comparable to say 30K in LATAM, right? 30 to 40K. I'm doing public math, but roughly.
Mhm.
You can't compare a six-figure role to a $30,000 role. Those are just apples. Those aren't apples to apples. And I think a lot of
Right.
people do that when they're trying to think through like what's the level of quality of talent.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Because I could see how it'd be easy to just be kind of blind to it because you're used to hiring practices locally or nationally, right? As opposed to understanding, especially that monetary difference, but also the talent difference based on what you're trying to hire for or who you're trying to hire.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
talent, the quality is great, right? I think
Hmm.
it's if you can go through the hire process correctly, right? You either hired the right or wrong person. There's great people in each country, and there's different hubs, by the way. There's like Colombia's amazing, Argentina's amazing, that kind of stuff. Um, and there's countries that are less open to remote work than others, but that's a different rabbit hole. But anyway, so if you get bad talent, I wouldn't say it's the whole country it's off, right? It kind of feels naive to say that the U.S. is the only country in the world that has great talent. That's a wild
Hmm.
statement. So it must, if you didn't have a good experience, it must be either because it was a poor hiring process, you chose the wrong person, or you didn't onboard and train them properly,
Yeah.
right? Or manage them properly once they've after onboarding.
Right. Right. Interesting. And we're going to be wrapping up here shortly. I want to make sure I honor your time, but time wise, so if you're hiring from overseas on the other side of the world, I know in the Philippines a lot of people will agree to work US based hours, but a lot of them, you kind of have to make yourself available for when your people are working. That's not a problem if you're hiring in Latin America, right? We're all in roughly the same time zones, right?
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
So in Philippines, to your point, they'll work overnight, so that they work U.S. hours. For me, one of the like many reasons I do LATAM, but one of them is I do know that there's this subculture in the Philippines of just a ton of people who work overnight, and so they're used to it. I had Filipino workers ask me to work the overnight shift, and I would I think probably 3 to 4 times I asked them if it wasn't time sensitive. Like, do you want to work normal hours? They said no, and so it still didn't sit well with me, right? That they're working from like 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. or whatever. I made up public math there, but like
Mhm.
that they worked overnight versus LATAM, it's the same time zone, right? So I'm in Colombia now. It's in 1 hour behind Boston, my hometown, right? And to the other extreme is Argentina. It's 1 hour ahead of Boston, right? So like the time
Yeah.
zones.
That's perfect. It's just as if you're doing business with someone on the East Coast and you're based on the West Coast, it's a max 3-hour difference. So
Yep.
that's a
Yeah.
big advantage.
Exactly.
Awesome, man. Well, this has been a ton of fun. Is there one thing about hiring overseas, if we can leave our audience with one thought, maybe one piece of either advice or inspiration to possibly take that step to explore hiring from Latin America, what would that be?
I think people is the highest leverage thing you can do, right? I mean, if you listen to Vol, there's like code and other things as well, right? But one of the biggest things you can do to increase leverage in your business is people side. And when you don't hire overseas, you can't you can't use as much leverage, right? What I mean by that is if you have just to do simple math, you have a 100K role, right? You have to wait until you have enough budget to hit 100K, right? Versus if you hire it offshore, you can hire now, right? So you can hire
Hmm.
earlier, but if you still have the same 100K budget, you can hire 3 people, right? And so
Right.
not only are you able to hire sooner and start the compounding effect, you can also hire more roles and get compounding in different parts of your business, right? And so I do think that not hiring overseas just really holds you back from the leverage and compounding that you can create in getting that started sooner.
I love it. It's really about shortening that time frame to building your business, and this is one of those almost a cheat code that you can implement in your company and get to where you want to get a lot faster. So,
Yeah, it really is. I mean, when I was working with the corporates, they use it all the time, and we used it, right? Like I would do the strategy during the day, and then pass off the deliverable to my team in India at night, and then wake up the next day and have it done in the morning so we can hand it to the client, right? And so,
right.
like the speed that we can work at when it's being worked at during their normal hours, but our night was incredible. But then from a LATAM perspective, we're able to build out a full team, whereas before we could only have one person, right?
Mhm.
So the leverage is incredible.
All right. Awesome, awesome. I love it. Well, man, this has been a ton of information. I think our audience and myself included, we have a lot to go off of in terms of thinking about the possibility and maybe taking action on hiring talent out of Latin America to take our businesses to the next level. I want to make sure everybody out there can get a hold of you if they want to reach out, say hi, maybe ask some questions, or check out Talent HQ. What are the best ways to get a hold of you, Mr. Brian O'Connor?
Absolutely. So two ways. One is the Talent HQ website, talenthq.co. And the other one is I have a weekly newsletter. Every week I put pretty detailed nerdy guides on these different parts, right? Onboarding, getting the management part right, growing the business marketing channels, everything you need to grow and run your business at my newsletter, which is outliergrowth.com.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, make sure you check out and get out on that newsletter, outliergrowth.com and talenthq.co. That's .co. Brian, man, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Amazing. Great chatting, Brian.
All right.